Today we're going to do a full performance review of our 670cc Predator V-twin powered vintage Renault. And we're going to find out how this unusual engine swap compares to our past projects, which were also powered by unusual engines. Now, if you're new to the channel, welcome aboard and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Anyway, this channel likes to do unusual engine swaps for fun, and we like to see how fast we can get a car to go with not much of an engine under the hood. Actually, the fun part of these projects is doing the performance modifications to make a slow car, well, slightly less slower. In the past, we've stuffed a 212cc and a 420cc engine in this Honda Insight. Now, in order to get the car to go faster, we ended up adding fuel injection and a supercharger to the Honda, and that got us up to 70 miles per hour, which ain't half bad for a 420cc engine from Harbor Freight. And of course, we recently just finished fooling around with this 719cc Kubota Turbo Diesel Saturn Coupe. This car just kept delivering results, and it was a truly amazing project. Now, today we're going to do some basic tests to generate some baseline data so we can keep track of what works and what doesn't work on this 54-year-old French-built Renault. Of course, on this car, we replaced the 50-something horsepower 4-cylinder engine with a completely stock, right-out-of-the-box 2-cylinder 670cc Predator engine. Now, keep in mind, the original 4-cylinder in this classic Renault was more or less destroyed, and if nothing else, this unusual engine swap will give the car a new lease on life. So in the previous episode, we did take the Renault out on its maiden voyage, but due to production deadlines, we weren't able to give the car a proper road test. So today, let's just take our time and have a better look at what this car can do. Well, despite sitting unused for the last 37 years, this Renault seems to be in really good mechanical condition. The steering is sharp and feels great for such a lightweight car. Now the tires, well, that's a different story. These tires were recently replaced with brand new 135/80/15 radials. Now this is an odd sized tire nowadays and they're hard to find. So we went for a set of Firestone reproduction tires offered by Coker. And let me tell you, these tires ain't cheap. But due to the unusual bolt pattern on the rims, all the other options were significantly more expensive, and I sort of like the original look of these wheels and the ultra skinny tires. The interior on this goofy car has held up remarkably over the years, and while it does have some flaws, it's certainly comfortable and unusual. I think when you consider that the car is both vintage and French built, the unusual features sort of make sense. Now the one thing that seems to work well is the speedometer. However, it's hard to see and measure the speed accurately with a video camera, so we added a GPS speedometer. Now, unfortunately, the GPS speedometer is also hard to see, but when we can see it, we can get a good reading of the speed. So this speedometer is a low-cost product available from the Jungle site, and I've used similar speedometers before on our project cars. Now the thing I've noticed is these speedometers need to be calibrated because they can be off a little bit. And long story short, we found that this speedometer was off by 2 miles per hour when we checked it. Not a big deal. There's a simple procedure that requires some button pushing, and now the speedometer reads correctly. So let's take the Renault back on the road and find out what the top speed is with the completely box stock 2-cylinder Predator engine. And it looks like 64 miles per hour is all this engine will deliver. Meh, last week when we took the car out for its first drive with the uncalibrated speedometer, we saw 67 miles per hour. So indeed, the car is slightly slower than what we previously thought, but I'm sure we can fix that with a few modifications to the engine. Now, we didn't build this car for fuel economy, but a lot of folks want to know what this car can do, so let's find out. This car is equipped with a 2.5-gallon fuel tank, and that's not much fuel, but hopefully we'll have some left over after our 50-mile journey through the back roads of rural Kansas. Anyway, once the fuel tank's filled, we check the level so at the end of the test we can refuel the tank and find out how much fuel we consumed. I reckon it's time to take the car out for a ride. Now, the engine fires right up, and all we have to do is reverse the car. Easier said than done. You see, we're still having problems with reverse, and so far the best way to back the car up is, well, pushing it backwards. The exhaust system that came with the Predator engine is massive and gets real hot. Unfortunately, all the heat from the muffler gets dumped into the engine bay, so while we do our baseline test on the box stock engine, we'll be running the car with the hood or engine cover off in order to keep the temperatures down. Eventually, we plan on fabricating a set of headers, and that should help both with performance and keeping the temperature down in the engine bay. So on this fuel economy test, we try to keep the car at around 55 miles per hour, but sometimes we went a little faster and sometimes we went a little slower. On this test, the tires were inflated to 40 psi, which may be too much, especially for the front. Now, we'll need to figure out what's the best pressure for both safety and performance. Now, this is interesting. The rims on this car are riveted together and they require inner tubes. Well, inner tubes suck, so each of the rims were modified by installing rubber patches over the rivets, and that eliminated the need for inner tubes. Now, these tires were fitted in late April, and as of last week when we checked them, they were still at 32 psi. So I think the rubber patches over the rivets seem to work really well. Overall, this car is comfortable and fun to drive. The only thing that it really needs on a hot day like today is air conditioning. Now, oddly enough, these cars could be ordered with air conditioning back in the day, but on this car, the only relief from the heat is to open the windows, and that's exactly what I did. The reason I mention this is, it upsets some folks when I do fuel economy tests with the windows open. Well, in this case, it can't be helped. It's just too hot to sit in this car for over an hour with the windows closed. Now, I'm sure driving around with the engine cover off isn't helping the aerodynamics, but it's a necessary evil because right now I don't want to damage the engine from overheating it. I reckon we should head back to the shop and see how much fuel we consumed on this outing. Now, before we refueled the tiny fuel tank, we let everything cool off, including the fuel tank, and that ensures that the volume of the fuel is the same as when we started the test. Well, it looks like we consumed a total of 5.65 liters of gasoline, which works out to be 1.492 US gallons. And the total distance traveled today was 55.1 miles, and that works out to be 36.93 miles to the gallon. In the previous episode, I said the car would likely get 42 miles to the gallon, and it looks like I was a bit off. So I reckon some folks might be disappointed, but keep in mind when we stuffed the 420cc engine in the Honda Insight, the car only got 35 miles to the gallon on its first outing, and as we made improvements to the car, the fuel economy went up. As I recall, before we added the supercharger, the car was getting around 45 miles to the gallon. Unfortunately, we never checked the fuel economy after the supercharger was installed. Now, the Saturn got a remarkable 56 miles per gallon on its first outing, and eventually we were able to squeeze 80 miles to the gallon out of that car. So, if fuel economy is your thing, I think in the near future we should see an improvement once we sort out a few details. Now let's talk about performance. Since we discovered that the speedometer was slightly off, let's do another 0 to 55 mile per hour acceleration test with the calibrated speedometer. Wow, this car launches hard when you give it the beans. So there you go, 51 seconds to get to 55 miles per hour. So that's a few seconds more than last week, but this time around the speedometer was reading the correct speed. Now, due to the Independence Day holiday here in the States, we didn't get a chance to have the car weighed over at the Farmers Co-op, but theoretically this thing weighs about 1,800 pounds plus driver. So the 51-second acceleration time is pretty bad, or it's pretty good, and I reckon that depends on what you consider to be fast. Well, on second thought, that's pretty bad. So this 670cc Predator-powered Renault is going to need some work, and we already have a plan, don't worry about that. So let's take a look at today's data. Due to an error in the speedometer calibration, the new top speed was adjusted down to 64 miles per hour. Now, the 0 to 55 time was a dismal 51 seconds, which is a few seconds more than last week. And again, that's due to the speedometer error. The fuel economy was 37 miles to the gallon, which is likely close to what this car can get with the 4-cylinder engine. Now, our 1,600-pound Honda Insight managed to get 35 miles to the gallon on its first day of testing, and after some performance modifications, the fuel economy actually went up, and the best it got with the 420cc engine was 45 miles to the gallon. Now, as far as acceleration goes, with the fuel-injected supercharged intercooled 420cc engine, the Insight managed to get up to 55 miles per hour in 44 seconds, with an absolute top speed of 70 miles per hour. Now, keep in mind, we threw a lot of technology at that car in order to achieve those numbers, and I think the supercharger was a bit much for that engine, but it survived. On its first day of testing, the 719cc diesel Saturn had a bad day and only managed to get up to 45 miles per hour for a top speed, but after adding a turbocharger and fiddling with the fuel settings, we unofficially got the car up to 76 miles per hour. So the diesel Saturn started off as a fairly slow car, and the first time we managed to get it up to 55 miles per hour, it took 1 minute and 6 seconds. And again, after adding the turbo and adjusting the fuel, the Saturn managed to get up to 55 in a mere 23.36 seconds. Not too shabby. The Saturn never disappointed when it comes to fuel economy, and the first time we measured it, the car got a phenomenal 56 miles to the gallon, and it only went up from there. By the time we were done testing the car, it was getting 80 miles to the gallon, but you know, diesel engines are known to be thrifty, and that car was no exception. So overall, the Renault did okay. It wasn't the greatest, and it wasn't the worst. You know, this engine is completely stock, and it's begging to be modified, and that's just what we're going to do. Thanks for joining us today, and hopefully you're excited to see what we're going to do with this car over the next several episodes. If you enjoyed this video, why not click on the like button, and if you're not already subscribed, consider subscribing. It's as easy as clicking on the button. Until next time.